Good afternoon, Columbia City. This is WJHS 91.5. You're listening to the JWCP Game-Activity Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Peters. Here's your co-host, Wyette. Come on to say hey, buddy.
How's it going?
And we have your guest star this week, Mike. Say it good.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. All right. So this is Retro Week, Mike. So a little bit for I don't want to be rude. For reference though, ballpark age. What are we working with here?
45. I'll give you the nose on age. I'm 45 years old.
Awesome.
Right in the meaty part of that Generation X curve.
That's nice. All right. So forgive me if I'm wrong, but you are pretty close to where video games started. You know, is that?
Well, it all depends on what you consider the start, right? Like most people probably would say Pong, but that's a little bit before me. I vaguely remember it, but I started with Atari when I was about 6.
Atari. All right. Well, let's start with that. So. Or actually, where do you want to start? You want to start with at the very beginning?
Atari's fine.
All right, Atari. All right, so Atari games. So what Atari did you get? The very first generation or?
Sure. Well, they didn't call it, I don't believe they called it the 2600 at the time. It was just Atari, but it was the 2600.
Awesome.
So.
All right, so from back then, what was your favorite game as Atari? What took up your most time, you know?
Well, those are two different questions, right? So I would say that my favorite game was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was rare for an Atari game in that it had multiple screens and you had to collect things in a certain order. It was actually pretty advanced for an Atari game. But the one that probably took up the most time was a game called Ice Hockey, which is really awful compared to today. But, you know, at the time it was revolutionary. So even though there were only 4 players, I would still play it for hours at a time.
So you said your first game, your favorite game was The Lost Ark, right?
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, yeah. So you said it had 4 screens. What does that mean?
Multiple screens. So as opposed to just being, you know, the early video games, it was a single screen. So you didn't move your character off screen into a whole new. No, basically it was levels. It was the first stab at level creation. You think of a game like Asteroids or Space Invaders or Missile Command, it's a single screen. And, and you move sprites around, even Pac-Man, you move sprites, but you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark, your character moved throughout the screen, and when he would move off screen, it would, you know, roll to a brand new area.
Oh, okay. All right. So
I would recommend checking it out, except that, you know, emulated Atari games aren't very impressive. I mean, if you've messed with emulators at all, there are lots of Nintendo games that are still fantastic, but it's hard to find. It's hard to find an Atari game that's worth playing, even on an emulator.
Yeah, well, I used to play emulators and ROMs back in 2016. I know they kind of made a comeback in 2016 for. I think that was a good thing that they came back a little bit. You didn't see them too much, but in the more dedicated gaming people you saw in that community, you really saw those Atari games come back. I think it was really cool. So, Wyatt, any questions so far?
Well, I was just going to bring up the subject about emulators. I actually, quite a while ago, back in like 6th, 7th grade, we used to play a lot of emulations because, you know, we were on Chromebooks. You know, we just wanted to mess around. They actually, a lot of them got lawsuited, like a bunch of lawsuits. Because, you know, it's kind of legal, you know, to have companies, you know, games just on a website with no license and all that. So it's kind of hard to find emulators nowadays, you know, even harder now.
It's a little silly, too, when you think about it. The whole point of the copyright is to prevent other people from making money off of your property. And it's not like, you know, Activision's still making money off Atari boxing, right? You can't buy it anymore. They're not making any more money off of it. So it's not like having the ROM on some website is going to deprive them of further income. So I can understand, maybe I could understand like Nintendo 64 or things that aren't quite as old, but no one's buying. I guess maybe they want to be able to sell it themselves, which they started doing. Right now you can buy official Super Nintendo and Nintendo emulators from a store.
Yeah, right. I think it's just a weak jab at, you know, taking something that people love and, you know, just they want to make money off of it, obviously, but they're not going to have a huge market nowadays. But there's still people who want to play that game who haven't experienced it, like the new generation. Like new generations, they should still go back to arcade games and stuff because it keeps it alive. It keeps it what people started with and what games are now today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually would love. I've had this idea for a while. I would love to see a retro arcade that used because they used to have real arcades. Like if you watch a movie like War Games, I don't know if either of you are familiar with that movie, but Matthew Broderick opens the movie in an arcade playing Galaxia, I think, and like that was real. Like that there, we used to have arcades and you could go and they were $0.25 each and you could spend hours there playing all kinds of different games. I think that'd be cool to have again, but we don't have any here.
Yeah, unfortunately. I wish they didn't. I think a lot of what the old games used to be, I think we've like branched off from like let's take a big game like Red Dead Redemption 2, the cowboy games. I don't think we would have had that detailed, that much fun playing Red Dead Redemption if Oregon Trail never came to existence, I think we've came a long way from where our video games stand now. I don't even think we would have Red Dead Redemption 2 if it wasn't for Oregon Trail, really.
I hate to admit it, I've actually never played Oregon Trail.
Oh, really?
I know, I'm familiar. You've died of dysentery, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
I've actually never played it.
It's a fun game. I think that was one of the first games I ever played, actually. Well, in the top 10. I know Minecraft was one of those big ones I played, but the Oregon Trail was a big one I played too. When I first got my very first tablet, I played the Oregon Trail off of a ROM, which we were just talking about. Later got taken down off the Play Store because of copyright reasons, which is ridiculous, but So moving on from Atari and ROMs and what were they called?
Retro games.
Well, not retro games, but
emulators.
Thank you, emulators. So moving past Atari, more. Man, I need to stop saying So.
All right. So actually, I really wanted to touch on this in a past podcast, but I never really got the question in. And I think you'd be a pretty viable audience to ask or guest. You would say. Did you ever have any experiences with arcades and stuff, going with friends to an arcade and playing games, sitting there for hours? Or?
Like an arcade game at a friend's house?
No, like arcades, like, when you go to a place like an arcade, like, no, that's
like,
there was an arcade near my house growing up.
You ever have any like personal, like really fun experiences?
Honestly, no. It was neat, but it wasn't like there was no, this is sad. The only real memory I have is of not having a quarter. I dropped a quarter because there was a game. It was like a fire truck game. It had 2 steering wheels, so someone could control the front of the truck and someone could control the back of it. And so I sat down and I dropped my quarter, and it slid down between the seat and the side, and I couldn't reach it, and I was very sad. And I asked my brother for another quarter, and he wouldn't give me one. So,
man,
sadly, that's my most memorable arcade memory.
Well, at least it's a memory that you have with your brother, in the arcade, I guess. So
but they were very cool. I mean, the arcades were very neat.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of variety of games. There was the old football game with the the track wheel where you spin it, and my favorite arcade game was Punch Out, the original boxing game. They had one. I played hockey growing up, and they had one in the snack bar area, and I used to like playing it there.
Really? Wow. I think it's cool that we still have kind of arcades around nowadays. You see Pizza Hut still having an arcade, and a bowling alley, they still have arcades. Mainly anything that has an attraction, like a smaller place that has an attraction like Pizza Hut. Not our Pizza Hut locally, but I know I've been to plenty of Pizza Huts around the world. Around the world, what am I, cultured or something? Around Indiana. I know I've been to plenty of them, not just Pizza Hut that have arcades. I know Pizza King does. I know back from my old town, they had a humongous arcade, Pizza King did. And I think they had one old game. I think they might have had a newer version of Punch Out. Maybe it was like Smash Bros, like Punch Out style. I don't know. I know they had a lot of them, though, back then. Speaking of Smash Bros, isn't that a Nintendo game?
I don't know.
I'm Well, Nintendo Switch nowadays, so that would, yeah, it is awesome. So bringing in the Nintendo line. So did you ever play any Super NESs, Nintendos, Nintendo Super?
Yeah, so I had a Nintendo, and that was the first console I had because the Atari was really shared in our house, but the Nintendo was mine. I got it when I was like 10 or 11, and it was such a jump in quality from Atari. And it was only a couple years difference. It wasn't like it was 10 years later, but in my opinion, it was easily the biggest jump in terms of you think of the different generations. PS5 and Xbox are coming out now with their next generation. But the jump between Atari and Nintendo was really significant. And like I said, there are still Nintendo games that are a blast to play even today. Even just Legend of Zelda, the big ones are great. Castlevania and so I'm a very big fan of Nintendo.
That's awesome.
And I never had a Super Nintendo though. I had after my Nintendo, I had a Sega Genesis. And I had 2 games for it, NHL 94 and NHL 95. So I had a bit of a lull there where I didn't have a lot of video games.
That's awesome. So for a future question, I want to get this information now. How do you mind me asking how much both of those consoles cost back then, not including inflation?
I have no idea.
No idea.
Yeah, I have the idea that, well, I say no idea, but I think the Nintendo cost somewhere around $100 back in 1986. So I don't know what that would be today.
I'm sure we can find out. We have Google at our hands and fingertips all the time. So pushing forward past the Nintendo, or not the Nintendo, but the Atari and these. Did you just have the Nintendo? You said you didn't have the Super Nintendo?
Correct. I never had a Super Nintendo. I went to the Sega Genesis, and I think my next console after that was the first PlayStation.
Ooh, the first PlayStation. We haven't talked about the first PlayStation on this podcast, which is, I think, is weird to think like. So tell me about the first PlayStation. I've never played it. I've only played the second through current now.
So it's funny, as much as I'm a fan of retro games, my first PlayStation was a bit of a piece of junk. It actually made a loud clicking sound. But I believe it was the first major console that used a DVD, which was a really big deal at the time. And Final Fantasy VII came out for the original PlayStation, which was a really big game.
So you said your PlayStation was kind of a piece of junk because it made a clicking sound?
It did, yeah. When the disc would spin, it would click, 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 click.
Oh,
click,
really? The disc drive had a problem.
I'm sorry?
The disc drive had a problem?
No, it was I think it was CD-ROM. It wasn't DVD. I think it was CD-ROM at the time. Yeah, no, because it spun a disc you put into it as opposed to a cartridge.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because every PlayStation I've ever owned, not the PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 3, actually 2 PlayStation 3s and a PlayStation 4, all of their disc drives have failed to work after a few years, but I transported it back and forth from my old house to new house and my mom's house and dad's house. So I transported it all over, but the only thing that seemed to ever fail was the mechanical disk drive, which is weird to think that the hard drive didn't fail because I know they had mechanicals in there.
Yeah, honestly, I was never a huge console gamer after the Nintendo. I really kind of switched to PC, and even today, I mostly play games on a PC. Even though I really loved Nintendo, after that, I never did a lot of console gaming. It was mostly PC gaming, and in fact, the very first game that I ever got really addicted to, even though I played a ton of Nintendo, the first game I ever got, like where I lost track of time, was SimCity and it was on PC. And yeah, actually, my girlfriend was out of town, and they wanted me to watch her dog, and I stopped by to watch her dog. And while I was there, I'd heard about this game, and I wanted to try it out. And then, like 6 hours later, I realized that I hadn't moved.
I think that's a fascinating thing, the way time flies when you're having fun. Like, I know that's the saying, but playing video games, just time just moves different in video games. I swear.
It does, but I don't know that I've really ever experienced that so much with a console game. I feel like that happens to me with PC games, but I don't know with console as much. But I'm really not into, I'm not into fighting games like Smash. I've never been a big fan of that. I'm much more into, RPGs or Sims or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I am too. I've never really got into the fighting games like Super Smash Bros. I almost said Super Nintendo. That would have been bad. I always try to keep an open mind doing the podcast, though. I've always I've always wanted to play Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo Switch nowadays, but I just never. I don't have a Nintendo Switch, so I can't. But if I ever got the chance, I don't know if I would enjoy it or not. I don't know.
Well, there's an extra element for me because, being the age that I am, I now have an 11-year-old who can beat me at video games now, and that's a transition. I'm sorry, did I say 11? I meant 14.
Honestly, that's kind of an accomplishment, though. You raise your kid, and then your kid beats you at the game you play.
You might think that would feel like an accomplishment, but it really just makes you feel old. And the first game he beat me at was Smash, and it's just the older you get, frenetic games with a lot of movement and activity, they just I don't find them appealing. It's too much. And no, I don't feel like it was an accomplishment. It was more like a milestone that you don't want. But I'm over it. I'm over it now. I've moved on.
So you were talking about the graphics right when we started this podcast. So if we compare a game like Grand Theft Auto 5, which was groundbreaking to the video game industry with their graphics and their playable content and everything, comparing the graphics to then and even 4K, how do you feel about the graphics back then and now for how good the game looks? How do you feel about that?
I think it really depends on what exactly you're talking about. So, you think about Atari, and you literally had squares on, I think, 16 colors. And even then, I think you could only have, so many different colors. I think it was only 4 different colors on screen at a time or something ridiculous. And that's unplayable. Like, I don't care how good, like I mentioned, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I love that game. It's not playable today. There's nothing. But you look at Nintendo, it's 8-bit graphics, and those games are still playable. And you think of games like Terraria, or even Minecraft. Those are not visually impressive games, but they're still a lot of fun. So although graphics are impressive, and the closer we get to photorealism, it's breathtaking, and it's hard to believe like these are real video games. And I think for some series that's you need that, like Grand Theft. So the first Grand Theft Auto game that I really loved was Vice City. But you compare it, which was a blast. But if you tried to play Vice City today, it's not going to be as fun. And so the graphics really matter for a game like Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto 5 is fantastic. Can't wait for 6 if they ever make it. But there's lots of games where I think the graphics really don't matter. And I think the fact that you've had success with those kind of, retro graphics, those 16-bit, Shovel Knight's another one. Anyone could write a game like that. So the graphics don't really matter.
Yeah. So I want to go back to those retro. So we talked about retro consoles a little bit. We kind of touched on retro games. So you said, did I ask you what your favorite game from the Atari series was, or just in general?
No, you just asked for, you did ask Atari. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thinking retro games, what was your favorite ultimate game? If you could go back and play right now, what would that be?
Tecmo Super Bowl. And there's no hesitation. And people always kind of give me a funny look when I answer that. I'm not saying it was the best game ever made, but it's easily my favorite. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and if you're from Pittsburgh, you're a Steelers fan. You just have to be. And Tecmo Bowl came out, and I think there's like 8 teams in it, and it's kind of like a 7-on-7. It was a big deal, but it wasn't really football. And then I remember, Nintendo used to make this thing called Nintendo Power, which was a magazine that you could get. And I remember when they announced that Tecmo Super Bowl was coming out, and it was 28 teams at the time, all 28 teams. It was going to be 11-on-11, like real football. And they were going to have, the players were going to have attributes, and it was going to keep stats across the whole season. It was revolutionary for the time. And I just loved it. And I played that game, and people still play it. There's websites devoted to updated Tecmo Super Bowl rosters based on the current players. So that would be my answer.
So what was your favorite controller design? Like, do you have any critiques on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So the original controllers for the Atari were garbage. They were joysticks with a single button. And aside from lack of functionality, they broke all the time because it just wasn't a good design. And Nintendo came out with probably the first real controller. You had actual buttons and the ubiquitous D-pad. It was super uncomfortable, though. I don't know if you've ever held a Nintendo controller for any period of time. It's a rectangle, and the corners are not rounded. So they made a controller called the NES I want to say the NES Max or Advantage. One of the two, both of those existed. One was a joystick, and one was a controller that was kind of like rounded and had the D-pad was actually like a button that could move 360. It was awesome. Even to this day, that's my favorite controller of all time. But I will say, in today's consoles, you can't beat the Xbox controller. But I'm surprised that the PlayStation controller doesn't get more grief. I've used both extensively, and in my opinion, there's no contest. The Xbox controller is so much more comfortable than the PlayStation controller. And I don't know why Sony doesn't do anything about it. Maybe I'm the only person that cares. I don't know, but I think the Xbox controller is the pinnacle of controller design. But I really do miss that old NES. I think it was the Max, the NES Max.
Yeah, I think you might be right. It's always nice to go back to the oldies and, see what you started with and how comfortable the controllers were back then compared to now. But, it's more of a nostalgic thing, to look back and find your favorites and your least favorites. Which one was the most uncomfortable controller back then? Like talking more retro kind of thing?
Probably the original NES controller, and that rectangle was pretty uncomfortable. Something else that's interesting, I'm sure, for Generation X is how, because when you're young, you want things to be more complicated. So you hand a 16-year-old a controller with 2 buttons on it, and they're going to look at it like you're crazy because they want more. They're capable of more. Well, as Generation X has gotten older, the controllers have gotten more complicated, but we've gotten older. So imagine handing a boomer a PlayStation controller, and they're going to think it's from another planet. So it's a bit of a challenge keeping up because you got a lot of buttons now on a controller, especially with the multiple triggers in the back, and it can be overwhelming for us old folks.
So earlier I asked you how much the Atari cost, and you said around $100. Is that correct?
I'm guessing in 1986 dollars. That sounds, maybe it was 200. I don't know.
With inflation in thought, actually, let's keep inflation let's keep it in thought. So with inflation in thought, do you think a $500 price point on a PS5, compared to what you had back then for an Atari, do you think a $500 price point to have some fun is fair to the...
Sure. Yeah, I do. I don't see that as a problem. And even the games really haven't, because games back then were probably $20. I don't know. And even Nintendo games back then, I feel like the price of games has not kept in pace with inflation. They have not gone up as much. So you think about, you go to the movie. I know this isn't retro per se, but I'll be brief. You think about, you go to the movies, you're going to spend, if you take your family, you can spend $50 by the time you're all said and done for a 3-hour movie. But for a $60 video game, you could get tens, or if it's good, hundreds of hours of entertainment out of it.
Yeah. I think that's a fun concept to think of how you that's like a money management question for retro stuff, to think how you would spend your, if you $60 movie or $60 video game, and you would think well, what do I want? 3 hours of fun or 3 hours of movie time? Or, if we talk about GTA 5 really quick, they had over 100 hours of plus content minus the cutscenes. I think that cuts out 5 hours. So you have 95 hours of just pure and absolute gameplay. I think that's crazy to think. And talking about, I kind of want to stray away from this, keep it retro. So talking about Grand Theft Auto 5, there are speedrunners for that game. And to think about it, there are speedrunners for a lot of games. So I have to ask, were there speedrunners in a say back then for the Atari, the NES, the Super Nintendo, or just the Nintendo?
Well, there might have been, but they weren't famous because there was no YouTube. There was no internet back then. So, I remember, you want to talk about retro, they had this thing, So Activision was a group of programmers so Atari wouldn't give accolades to their programmers. They wouldn't give credit to any individuals because basically all these games back then were being written by one person. So Atari wouldn't let anybody know who wrote these games, and these programmers were getting angry. So they left and they created their own company called Activision. That's where Activision came from. But Activision used to have this thing with their games where if you did certain things in the games and you could take a picture of it, you could get a badge or a patch that you could sew on like a jacket. And for example, there was a game called Kaboom that I played a lot, and it literally was just a guy moving back and forth from the top of the screen, dropping bombs, and you had to catch him with these buckets of water. And if you reached a certain point, number of points, his face changed. Like this was the peak of gaming in the early 80s. It sounds silly now, but at the time it was revolutionary. So, you didn't really complete games back then. There was an Atari game called Adventure, which was, it's a landmark game. You can read about it on Wikipedia. And that game was completable. Like there was an objective, and there were difficulty levels. And if you did everything, you reached the end point and the game was over. That was very rare for Atari, or even Nintendo, I guess, in some respects, because, you think about it, video games, they came originally from arcades, where the goal was to get you to put in as many quarters as possible and keep playing. So games like Pitfall just went forever until you died and you accumulated points. So the idea of speedrunning really wouldn't make much sense back then, because games really didn't finish them until later, like Super Mario Brothers. You could get to the end, right?
So I have a question. So with I don't exactly know how to word this. So if you could choose between games nowadays and the retro games you had back then, would you choose those retro games over if you had to only play one? Like if you had to play new games, new age games, or retro games, would you rather play retro games or new age games?
That's a tough question. If I had to choose between consoles, like if I could only have one console for the rest of my life, it would absolutely be Nintendo, and with zero hesitation. I wouldn't think twice about it. But in terms of, I think modern PC gaming it's just superior. And I mean, there's lots of PC games that just you just can't compare the two. It's a different gaming experience. You talked about putting 100 hours of bonus content into GTA 5. You can beat Super Mario Brothers in 10 minutes, even if you're not good at it. So, we had to put more energy into games back then. And I deal with that with my kid, right? He plays a game for, 15 hours and he's bored with it already. And back then the games were so repetitive, and that's all you had. So I think it took more imagination to play those games. You had to put more of yourself into them than you do with modern games. So to answer your question, if I were choosing just consoles, I would go with the Nintendo, but overall modern games were better.
All right, folks, that will do it. This was the JWCP podcast. I'd like to thank Mike so much for coming on. I know it was last minute. We really made this happen for number 5, this podcast. I think it's awesome to think that in the early days we can bring in such close people to me and Wyatt's personal life. I think it's awesome that we are able to bring in such close people to us. I know you're more my friend than Wyatt's. Wyatt doesn't know you that much, but still, I think it's awesome to think that you were one of the first people that I actually interviewed and had on a guest for our show. But that will do it for JWCP. You can follow us on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, all at JWCPGA. That's the @ for every single one of them. This is Jonathan Peters as your host. We have Wyette Conrad as your co-host. Say hey one more time.
Thank you for listening.
And Mike, anything to say before the listeners?
No, it's a blast. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, no problem. All right, this is JWCP. We'll see you next week.